All right, so now we're going to wrap up the look at factor markets by talking about the cost minimizing input combination, or in other words, we're going to be looking at how firms might decide or make decisions about what we call the optimal mix, which means the optimal mix of factors of labor and capital, of capital and land, or whatever, to see if they are at the most efficient point they can be as far as the number of units of labor they are hiring in combination with the capital that they're using, so forth and so on. Because firms do not use just one or the other. They employ a combination of factors. They have, because factors like labor and capital, they can be substitutes for each other. I might utilize machines to substitute actual people, the way, for example, that maybe self-checkout machines do at some grocery stores, but they also complement each other. You have machinery, but you also have workers that are using that machinery, so there's usually a combination that's involved. So what we're going to be looking at here is the formula that we would use to compute and understand and therefore make better decisions about the optimal mix of resources or factors of production that firms would want to use. And this is not very much to explain, so it doesn't take very, very long to go through the principle here or the formula, so that won't take us very long at all, and then we'll work through a couple of practice problems here to illustrate the principles that I'm going to talk about here first for a second. So firms are going to select an input combination that has the lowest cost. That makes sense. We know that firms are going to want to be efficient, and they're going to be doing that where they are utilizing their resources at the lowest cost that is possible. They don't want to be at a situation where they have a higher cost when they could be at a situation where they could have a lower cost. So of course they want to have the lowest cost as possible. In order to do that, what they need to make sure happens is they want to have the highest possible marginal product from each dollar spent on input. So they want to make sure that every dollar that they're adding, every dollar that they're spending on labor, every additional dollar that they're spending on capital or whatever, that they are getting the maximum additional units, marginal product from those resources that they are employing. And firms are going to adjust their hiring of inputs until the marginal product per dollar is equal for all inputs. Now, what you're going to find this is very, very similar to, in fact, it's almost the exact same, just different terminology, just a different way of looking at it. This is extremely similar. In fact, it's the exact same skill as the marginal utility stuff that we did back several months ago, the marginal utility per dollar, and that people are going to consume goods until the marginal, two different goods until the marginal utility per dollar of those goods is the same. This is basically the same concept, but instead of talking about marginal utility per dollar, we're talking about marginal product per dollar. So they want to hire to where the marginal product per dollar of capital and the marginal product per dollar of labor, or whatever combination of inputs you are referring to where those things are equal. So this is your cost minimization rule. Very important, and this is what we're going to spend the rest of this doing examples with and making sure we understand how to utilize it and how to calculate with it. The cost minimization rule, which we just described in that previous bullet, but here's the actual formula that you will use. It needs to be where the marginal product of labor divided by the price of that labor, which is the wage, is equal to the marginal product of capital. That K there, K is usually used to represent capital, over the rental rate of that capital, which is the price of that capital. You may recall that the whole marginal utility per dollar that we learned several months ago, that we found marginal utility per dollar by the marginal utility over the price. This is basically the same thing, except that here, instead of marginal utility over the price, we are talking about marginal product of labor over the price of that labor, or the marginal product of capital over the price of that capital. And the same would be true for land, okay? Now, so let's take a look at this in action and what this actually means, how we would actually articulate the results that we might get from that formula. All right. So here's an example. It says Max employs both labor and capital to produce his trinkets. Currently, the last unit of labor employed has a marginal product of 15 units. The last unit of capital employed has a marginal product of 40 units. The price of labor is $3 per unit, and the price of capital is $10 per unit. If Max is going to find the least combination of labor and capital, what should he do? So let's compute here how we'd figure this out, how we would use that formula, how we'd figure that out, and what that means. And again, forgive me for terrible writing here. Okay, so let's start by finding the marginal product per dollar of labor and the marginal product per dollar of capital here. And just like the way that we would calculate that, like we said, is the marginal product of labor over the price of that labor, which is the wage, and the marginal product of capital over the rental rate, which is the price of that. Okay, so if we, for our marginal product of labor, it says here that it was 15 units. Okay, so 15 units over the price of that labor, which is $3. So I'm going to divide by 3. So the marginal product of labor per dollar, sorry about going slow, is 5. Per dollar is 5. Okay. All right. Now for capital, they have the last marginal of the marginal product of the last unit is 40. We're going to divide by that by the price of that capital, which is 10. So their marginal product of capital per dollar. Sorry, I'm not going to spend too long trying to draw this, but that would equal 4. 40 divided by 10. Okay, so we have a marginal product of labor per dollar of 5 and a marginal product of capital per dollar of 4. What this means here is that for every dollar that is spent on labor, they get 5 units of output. And for every dollar that is spent on capital, they get 4 units of output. So the one that has more, that they get more units of output, the labor here, this is where they get sort of the most bang for their buck, as it was. So because they have a higher marginal product per dollar for labor than they have for capital, they want to hire more labor. So what this firm should do, what that is asking, it says what the answer to that would be they should hire more labor and less capital, because they're getting more output for every dollar that they spend on labor than they are for what they spend on capital. So the marginal product of labor per dollar is 5. The marginal product of capital is 4, and therefore, because 5 is more, they want to hire more labor and less capital. Let's take a look at another example. Suppose a firm has hired labor to the point where the marginal product of labor is 50 and the capital to the point where marginal product of capital equals 40. If the wage rate is $1 and the rental rate of capital is $2, then what should this firm do? Okay, so let's do the same thing. Let's find marginal product of labor per dollar and marginal product of capital per dollar. So if the marginal product of labor is 50 and the wage rate was 1, then that means that the marginal product per dollar of labor is 50, and if the most recent marginal product of capital is 40 and the rental rate of that capital is $2, then the marginal product of capital is 20. So again, what this means is that for every dollar that they spend on labor, they get 50 units of output. For every dollar they spend on capital, they're getting 20 units of output. 50 is much higher than 20, so this firm is going to want to hire more labor and less capital. So that would be the answer to that question and how we would find it. All right, this is a little bit more of an involved example, and this one's going to have us do a few more steps. This one's going to employ some of the other things that we've learned in some previous modules. So let's take a look at what we have going on here. Let's see. Okay, so first we're going to refer to the table. We're going to assume that the wage is $10 per day and the price of pencils is $1. First it asks us what the marginal product of labor of the fourth worker is. Well, we're going to need to see how much more product they gain when they go to that fourth worker, and they go from 120 products or pencils in this case at the third worker to 140 at the fourth worker. So the marginal product of labor of that fourth worker is 20, because as we go from 120 to 140, they're gaining 20 additional pencils or product there. So the marginal, where'd my There it is, sorry. So the answer there is 20. Okay, marginal product of labor per dollar of the fifth worker. Okay, so as we go from the fourth worker to the fifth worker, we're going from 140 to 150. So the marginal product of labor is 10, all right, but it asked about the marginal product of labor per dollar. So we need to take that 10 and divide it by the wage, which is 10. So that means it is 1, because 10 divided by 10 equals 1. Okay, and again, what that means is for every dollar that they spend on labor, they get 1 additional pencil, 1 additional unit of the good. If the marginal product per dollar spent on labor is 1 pencil per dollar, which we just figured that out, and the marginal product of the last unit of capital rented is 100 pencils per dollar, and the rental rate is $50 per day, is the firm minimizing its costs? Okay, so we already know what the marginal product of labor per dollar is. It is 1. Marginal product of capital per dollar. See, if the marginal product of capital employed is 100, it costs $50 a day to rent that capital. That means that the marginal product of capital per dollar is 2. All right, and that is higher than 1. So the firm is not minimizing their costs in this situation. They need to employ more capital and less labor, because 2 is higher than 1. So that's how we would answer that one. All right, let's do one last example before wrapping up here. And this says, suppose a firm is currently producing its desired quantity of output and that the firm's marginal product for labor is 20, marginal product for capital is 100, wage rate for labor is 5, rent for capital is 25. What should the firm do? All right, let's compute marginal product of capital per dollar and marginal product of labor per dollar. Starting with marginal product of labor, that's going to be that marginal product of labor, which is 20, over the wage rate, which is 5. So the marginal product of labor per dollar equals 4. Then our marginal product of capital here is 100. The rental rate of that capital is 25, meaning that the marginal product of capital per dollar is 4. So here they are equal. So that means that this firm is in the cost minimizing situation. They are at the optimal mix, and so they should continue to employ labor and capital in these exact same numbers that they are using, because it is equal. So they are at that cost minimization point, and they are utilizing the optimal mix. So hopefully this will help you understand what is meant by all of this. Once again, it is almost extremely, nearly the exact same thing as the marginal utility stuff, but just with a little bit of a different lens, which is what the factor market stuff, a lot of it is all about that, which is great because it makes it a little bit easier for us to do, and it helps us to reinforce and reteach and review those topics and skills and concepts that we learned several months ago.